understand the economy, you have to understand human nature.
This podcast is powered by Acast.
How you doing there? It is time for the podcast. And this podcast, which is going out a day or two before the funeral of Pope Francis, will all be about the idea is there a Catholic economics? Is there a Catholic economic worldview? Was the Pope Francis, representative of a very different, he was almost like John, a woke Pope, worldview?
Yes.
And where does that leave Catholicism now? But again, through the prism of economics, rather than the prism of morality or the prism of spirituality. Although you might say, and this is the key, that economics, given that it's really the study of human behavior, is also a moral, an environmental, an ecological, and a spiritual code. And in actual fact, Pope Francis wrote a very interesting encyclica called Laudatum Si, John, which we might even start this podcast about because it is the beginning of a story about the Pope. Anyway, how are you, Ed?
I'm good. Listen, I just want to, I take it a little bit of exception to you calling him a woke Pope. I mean, wokeism and the way the Pope expressed it was just Christian, is it not? With compassion and understanding and, as you say, a moral view of the world and the way we live.
You're absolutely right. But I think in contrast to what went before, so his views on gay marriage, his views on women in general, his views on poverty, redistribution of wealth, all those things, he was quite at odds with traditional Catholic thinking. In fact, so much so, John, that his entire papacy was an internal and monumental struggle between conservative Catholic forces, largely in the United States, but also in Europe, and a more liberal Catholic force coming from his own internal machinations. Because don't forget, Pope Francis was what was regarded as a radical Argentinian priest, comes from the radicalism of the 1960s, 1970s, where the dominant theology in Latin America, particularly from his crowd, was the Jesuits. And they had this notion of liberation theology, although he was not one, but he was from that gene pool. So I would say, when I say woke, John, I just say he was in direct contrast to what went before him.
Yeah.
And he presided over a struggle within the Catholic Church, which lent towards liberalism. That's what I'm saying.
And it's interesting that, you know, what we're seeing now is the kind of the politicalization of the church and of the Catholic Church. But I know that politics has always been a key part of the Catholic Church, but it's also a little bit like the MAGAization of the church between the liberals and the conservatives.
Well, it's
within the church.
It's really interesting you point out MAGAization, right? About 10 years ago, I was giving a lecture in a place called Notre Dame, which is an American university in Indiana, a Catholic university, in a place called South Bend, very Irish. But I was quite taken by the conservatism of the young priests there. They were younger than me, and they were very, very orthodox, very traditional. And what you're seeing in America is exactly as you're seeing in elections, John, that young males are leaning very traditional and orthodox and right-wing. And as they are in elections all over the world and they're voting right, they are too in that microcosm or that niche market, which would be the market for priests, John. And in the market for priests in America, the vast, vast majority now are being ordained from very orthodox colleges. So gone is the notion of the 1970s, 1980s liberal, and again, I go back to Francis, 1970s, 1960s liberal priest who would necessarily try to be much more accepting of the changes in society. These guys are digging their heels in, which is again, as you say, the MAGAization of the Catholic Church, which is going to be one of the major trends for practicing and lay Catholics and even lapsed Catholics, I think, over the course of the next 10 years. So in the same way as economics reflects social and cultural impulses, religious observance reflects social and cultural impulses.
absolutely.
And it has ever been thus. It has ever been
Yeah.
thus. You know, the churches have gone from conservatism to liberalism, from conservatism to liberalism. It's like a fashion. And I think you can maybe suggest that Pope Francis could have been the first and last of the liberal popes, or the first and last of the popes who were willing to embrace what I would call this sort of increasingly secularization or secular agenda. But we will see. We will see. It's all to
But
play for.
you actually met Francis, didn't you? What was he like?
He was amazing, amazing. I'll tell you a very bizarre story, right? On around Christmas week of 2018, I got a summons into the door of the house. Okay. And the summons was from not
A
the
parking
Dunleary.
ticket.
There wasn't the Dunleary Gardaí. It was the Carabinieri in Rome. And of course, I didn't open this letter. Shan did. So Shan says to me, there is a fine here of 60 euros issued by the Carabinieri in Rome, dated the 19th of September, 2018. What were you doing in Rome on the 19th of September of this year that required you to pay a fine that you clearly didn't pay at the time, gave them an address and hoped that this would go away? It hasn't gone away. It has now arrived at the doorstep. And that begins my story about when I met Pope Francis John.
Go on. I'm intrigued.
Bizarrely, this is the name drop of name drops. I met Pope Francis with Bono and Martin Lusteau, my old mate from Argentina.
Argentina, yes, yeah.
But I'll tell you, I'll give you that backstory in a second, but I'll tell you actually what happened at the summons, right? So we are meeting the Pope at 4:00 on the 19th of September in the Vatican, having a private meeting for an hour that went on for about 2 hours.
Nice.
That's the first thing. We're all supposed to meet at Bono's hotel at 3:00 to get a taxi to the Vatican so we're not late. Now, Martin, who knew the Pope and referred to the Pope as Jorge, right? So he was a guy he knew quite well. He said, look, be there early and we will get the audience. And this audience now, it took 2 years to put this together. Okay, there was 2 years of back channeling, back talking, people talking to people. And Martin and I had spent a lot of time nudging these two characters together, right? And in fact, in the end, the meeting with the Pope and Bono was amazing. It was extraordinary couple of hours to be present at. And I'll tell you all of that in a second. But I did what I usually do, John. As you know, I have a weakness for the Vespa, right?
Yes.
So I arrive in Rome and I'm in my little hotel in the Place d'Argentina that happened to be, which was no coincidence. And underneath the hotel was a little Vespa rental place. So I thought to myself, fantastic. I'm going to rent myself a Vespa and zoom around and whatever, right? And then what I'll do is I have the address of Bono's hotel and I'll just turn up there on the Vespa and then we'll all go from there together.
Yeah.
And we're meeting at 3:00. And Rome, anybody knows the traffic in Rome is a disaster. So you need to give yourself loads of time. And I think the meeting with the Pope is at 3:45. So we've given ourselves 3/4 of an hour. It's a long enough time. And of course, I go off at about after lunch, about 1:00 on my Vespa, zooming around, and I'm kind of daydreaming around and having a coffee, having an ice cream.
Looking all
and
Italian.
I zoom up, looking all Italian, get back in the Vespa. Then I realize, oh shit, it's 2:45. I'm meant to be at a hotel at 3:00 to go. I think that's grand. I'm on the Vespa. All is fine. I'll get there. I'm kind of trying to figure it out from memory. I'm zooming up a street. I'm zooming up 1 street, 2 streets, 4 streets. I find myself, looks like on a motorway. I start to get lost. I start to panic. I think, oh my God.
I can just imagine the big panic head on you.
Big panic head. And I can hear on my mobile phone there's some little beeps going and it's Martin and Bono saying, where the hell are you? Where the hell are you? We've got to go, you know. And I go down the street on the Vespa and I'm whoring down the street in the Vespa. And out pops 2 coppers out of a Fiat Mirafiori.
Yeah.
I jam on the brakes and he says to me, license, I don't have it. Insurance, I don't have it. It's all back in the hotel.
Sure.
So he says, who owns the Vespa? I said, it's mine. I kind of rented it. He said, okay, give me the papers. And I can't find the bloody papers in the rental place. And he's like,
disaster.
okay. a disaster clock is tick, 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 tick. And I'm trying to speak broken English. And he's saying, where are you from? He said, I'm Irish. Oh, Ireland. And then we mentioned Toto Scalacci. We have a laugh about that. But the clock is still ticking. I'm beginning to panic. And then he says, okay, look, listen, you got to come to the station with us because we got to do some paperwork. And I said, no, I can't go to the station. And then he gets anxious. He says, well, why can't you go to the station? What are you trying to hide? I said, look, man, you just wouldn't believe me. I said, I can't go to the station. I really, really need to go. And I said, I'll come back to the station tonight. He said, well, what could be so important? He said, I just think U2, obviously one of the biggest bands in the world, but in Italy, they are the biggest band in Italy. And I said, man, I look at you, won't believe me if I tell you that. He said, yeah, who are you meeting? I said, I'm taking Bono to meet the Pope. And the copper just laughs. He burst his hole. And I could hear him talking to the guy beside him in Italian, going, Irlandesi fantasia, like an Irish fantasist here. And I swear, man, I swear. And he said, so you are taking a Bono Vox to meet the Papa. And I said, yeah. And eventually they just pissed themselves laughing so much so. They said, just go. They just thought, who was this deluded daydreamer? Yeah. And I eventually zoomed into the thing and off we went to meet the Pope.
Were you on time, obviously, at the end of the day?
We were on time. Just about on time,
Good.
right?
Thank God for that.
There was lots of daggers in the taxi, I can tell you. Lots of daggers, okay? So we arrive in, and of course, because it was organized by Argentinians, and of course, Martin was there, his sister-in-law lives in Rome, his cousin was there, because lots of Argentinians live in Rome. So eventually, it was meant to be me, Bono, and Martin. It ended up me, Bono, Martin, and about 50 of the extended family coming in to meet the Pope, right? And again, what was lovely is the Pope, you go into, and it's true, he didn't live in the papal mansion. He lived very unassumingly in a place just off St. Peter's, right? Very unassuming, just set of rooms. Like it was almost like a big canteen. And it was really unassuming.
Like a college campus almost.
Almost like a college campus.
Yeah.
But the backdrop is as to why we met, which is fascinating, which is that the Pope was very, very much wedded to the idea of not going through the official channels of the Vatican for almost anything. And this is because he came from this movement in Argentina called the theology of the people. And this is really important to understand what he was all about. And the theology of the people was all about the idea that the strength of the Catholic Church doesn't lie in its hierarchies or its land or its wealth or its history or its potential political power. But the strength lies in the piety and the spirituality of the poor in the face of poverty, in the face of oppression. So it was very different to what was liberation theology, which was almost like a Marxist movement, which basically said to the poor, you believe these priests will lead you to the promised land. Now, the Pope took a very different view. He said, no, the way we create power in Argentina and all over Latin America is through a movement of the people. So he was very populist in the classic definition of the word populism.
This is what made him kind of more radical than other popes.
Exactly. And that's what made him quite different also to the radical left that had been the dominant philosophy of Jesuits in Latin America in the 1960s and 1970s. This is why, as Cardinal of Buenos Aires, he had an unusual relationship with Peronism, with all the military junta that went before. The reason was he derived his power from the symbolic value of the poor and the downtrodden being unified and in a kind of a spiritualistic Catholicism. This was his whole idea. Now, that led him to being very supportive of grassroots, bottom-up movements in education in Latin America.
Yeah.
So this is the meeting of minds between Bono and the Pope. So Martin and I, about 3 years before, had a conversation in Popeonomics. And Martin said to me, have you ever read anything written by the Pope?
Sorry, Mac, just to remind everybody who Martin is. Martin Gusteau is the leader of the
Radical Party in Argentina now.
Yeah.
And the Radical Party is a center-left amalgam of various different left-wing parties. And he's a very, very old mate of mine. And he is the guy who comes to Popeonomics every year, was the economics minister of Argentina years and years ago, fascinating guy. And so one afternoon in 2015, he says to me, have you ever read The Economics of the Pope? And I said, no, I haven't. He said, look, I have a encyclical that he has just written called Laudatum Si. And I said, what's it about? He says, read it. It's about climate change and economics.
Mm.
And it's about the circular economy. It is about the way in which capitalism and rapacious capitalism is destroying the planet. It's a way in which we cannot put a value on the planet. But the Pope's worldview was the way in which our economy brutalizes the planet is the same process whereby our economy brutalizes the poor. And he said that lack of concern for the planet has its humanist equivalent in the lack of concern about the poor. It's an amazing document. So I read
Yeah.
this and was really fascinated by it. I think I might have even written one or two pieces of journalism about it, but I was really fascinated by it. And then Martin was saying to me, you know, how you two are so incredibly popular in Argentina, and they are, in the same as they are in Italy, by far and away the biggest band. So he says, you know Bono? I said, yeah, well, like I do. And he said, you should maybe give him this encyclical because I think it's a really fascinating piece. So Bono's really and has always been fascinated by economics. And of course, he's very spiritual. He's very Christian. He's a believer. So I give him this encyclical and he says, oh, that's fascinating stuff. And we chat about it and we talk about it. And then Martin suggests at a certain stage, he said, look, there is a very, very interesting charity here, which is all about educating young children in Latin America, particularly young girls in Latin America. And it doesn't have a massive global reach. It doesn't have the infrastructure of the one campaign. It doesn't have Bono's ability to call people to make things happen, etc. But it's very, very supported by the Pope. Why? Because it is a bottom-up charity of the
Yeah.
people.
Yeah.
So after a couple of conversations, the idea emerges from the Argentinian side, would Bono meet the Pope and discuss a partnership between the one campaign and this Scholas educational
okay. Yeah.
charity in Argentina, but not just in Argentina, all over Latin America, because this would be a way of anchoring the Pope's notion that charity should always start at the bottom amongst the poor people. It can't be just something from the top down. And of course, from Bono's side of the equation, it was an opportunity for the one campaign to actually deploy their resources, their contacts, to help these guys out, in effect.
Yeah.
So Martin said, do you think it'll happen? So I pitched it. And Martin and I had to travel first to Rome to meet the Scholas people. And they were very Catholic, very Christian, really good people. And they had all worked with the Pope in the favelas in Argentina.
Yeah.
And it transpired that the only people that the Pope really trusted were people he had worked with on the front line in the favelas. And anyway, it transpired that this date, September of 2018, was the date that we traveled to Italy. And the extraordinary thing is, in the room, Martin was translating. Bono and the Pope sat down and chatted. And what I loved about this meeting was the first thing is the two of them got down to business, right? Before they started talking about God and religion and sociology and ecology and the world. And that was really interesting to see how the thing operated. That was actually, it was a deal that the one campaign were helping Scholas and Scholas were helping the one campaign. But the objective of both sides was to increase the lot and the standing and the education of young girls in Latin America who had been largely abandoned by the official education system because the official education system is entirely hamstrung and they've no money. So this was a great example of two charities coming together with two massive figureheads making something happen, which was an extraordinary thing to see. But what was lovely also about the Pope was he was so friendly. So as I said, Martin's mates and cousins all came along, right? I'm not too sure, did they want to meet Bono or the Pope or both?
Yeah.
But they did anyway, right? But what was fascinating is the Pope first started talking about football. He talked about some club called San Lorenzo in Buenos Aires that he supports and Martin supports. They were talking about that. But then he was so unbelievably warm. And you kind of knew you were in the presence, once you arrived, of I mean, this is the head of the Catholic Church.
Mm.
And he chatted to me. So my job was basically to be the economist in the meeting, right? And if there were economic issues they wanted to discuss, they'd come back to me. They didn't have to. They
Yeah.
were basically, it was an extraordinary meeting of minds, Bono and the Pope. So much so the Pope actually called him a mystic at the end of the discussion, because they started talking about religion and parables and philosophy.
Yeah.
And it was an amazing meeting. It was meant to go on for about 40 minutes. It went on for an hour and 40 minutes, chatted about everything. There was giggles, there was laughs, there was all sorts of things. But what was lovely at the end was this notion that the two of them came together to do something for people who can't do it for themselves.
Yeah.
And it was a really good meeting. And so there was I kind of like the fly on the wall. And by the way, you know, as far as I know, the Pope and Bono were in regular contact, obviously up until very, very recently, up until last week, as far as I know, discussing issues of the day, discussing charities, discussing where charities can go. You know, I mean, both
Set
of them.
lists, you know.
Yeah, set lists, exactly, bass riffs, the whole thing, drum and bass things. But both of them are completely committed. I know this too, and I know that, you know, we know that U2 and Bono have supported charities all their life, is basically trying to alleviate the position of poor people around the world. And it's a life's work for those guys. So it was nice to be able to kind of sit there and listen to the two of them and maybe even bring them together, as well as getting a summons from the Italian cops.
That's brilliant. But it's interesting, actually, that, you know, I was kind of flicking back over some of the stuff that Pope Francis has done over the last while. And I came across that piece that you were talking about, that you gave to Bono, where he talks about the kind of new tyranny and the unfettered capitalism and the ideology of money and all that. He was very kind of anti-capitalist in the American sense of capitalism.
Yeah.
But do you know what? Let's talk about the economics of the Catholic Church after a bit of this.
Great stuff.
Quick prayer. By the way, Mark, did you know that we've got some skin in the game? When I say we, I mean the family, our family, have some skin in the game in the new
I love this
election of the
Tell
Pope
me.
and the conclave.
So basically, I met the last Pope, and you're going to tell me you're connected to the new Pope. Tell us. We should call the podcast Two Popes.
Actually, that was a brilliant film. But my cousin's wife's cousin, okay, you with me?
Your cousin from America.
From America. His wife is Filipino.
Okay.
Leslie, she's lovely. And her cousin is Cardinal Tagle, I think is how you pronounce it. And he's kind of seen as the Asian Francis. He very much has the same kind of views of poverty and
John,
capitalism and all that kind of stuff.
I can see what's happening. I'm telling you, you're going to be on a Vespa, the two of us in Rome, going to the cousins do, getting tickets for the gig, getting backstage passes.
Well, come here. Before we were talking about, and you touched on the kind of the economics of the Catholic Church. So, I mean, this obviously stretches back 2,000 years.
Yeah.
But they have been in the thick of things in terms of economics and banking and all the rest. Give us a little background of the Catholic Church and that.
The Catholic Church. So Pope Francis, his real name was Jorge Bergoglio, but he took the name Francis. Now, why is that? Because he was the first Jesuit to ascend the papacy. Big deal for the Jesuits. But the question is, why did he adopt the name of a Franciscan, i.e. St. Francis? And the reason was all to do with symbolism. So St. Francis of Assisi, the fellow with the birds, do you remember him?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
Nice chap. Was all about humility and proximity to the poor. And the Franciscans still run soup kitchens in Dublin. Okay, so they are the order that align themselves most closely with the downtrodden, the disenfranchised, the poor. And the question then is, why did he do that? And what has that got to do with his worldview? It seems to me that that's got to do with his idea of what I was calling the theology of the people. Be close to the poor. These symbolic acts of identity with the very, very most downtrodden in society are part of the Franciscan creed. They're part, if you want to use of the Franciscan brand. That's what they
Yeah,
do.
yeah.
And if you look at all these various different orders, I've always thought the orders in the Catholic Church are a bit like football fans scrapping together, right? So they all believe in the same game, but they've got different teams and different styles and all that sort of stuff. So the Dominicans are different than the Franciscans, to the Jesuits, all that sort of stuff. But interestingly, St. Francis, so to give you some time, he dies in 1226 in Assisi, which is Umbria in Italy. I remember we've done lots of stuff in the past on the resplendent economy of late medieval Italy. So he's from that. His dad was a merchant, a silk merchant, and he was basically going to be going into the family business. And then he says, no, I want to side with the poor. So that's the first thing. But the second thing is what's probably unknown is the Franciscans were the very first people to operate pawn shops to lend money. And this is a
Okay.
massive, massive change from what went before. Also, it's a massive change for the narrative of economics. So there's a narrative of economics largely espoused in the UK, in Germany, that basically capitalism is a, Max Weber said, based on the Protestant work ethic, and it's a function of the Industrial Revolution. Protestants and Calvinists were very good at it, Swiss Calvinists, Dutch Calvinists, etc. And they were the people who kickstarted this capitalist economy. That is very much a sort of a shorthand. And it's people say Adam Smith, the Scottish Presbyterian, was, the great thinker of economics, but actually that's not true.
Mm.
In fact, you go back to the really interesting flourishing of the Italian economy in the late medieval times. This is the times of Dante and the times of Medici's, the times of Leonardo, the times of the Renaissance. All of that is based around Catholic city-states. So the Catholic Church must have been very much involved, and indeed it was. So what happened was the Franciscans figured out that the only way of alleviating the position of the poor, one way was through begging, but that was a very non-dynamic, static way of getting money to the poor. The other
Yeah.
one was lending money to the poor, but they couldn't lend money to the poor because the church banned the rate of interest. And they regarded the rate of interest as a thing called usury. Now, this is a very interesting,
Okay,
this is
yeah.
very theological. So there was two things at play here. Thomas Aquinas, who was a very famous Catholic philosopher, he spoke about a thing called the just price. And his idea was that you had to give some tangible work for money. Therefore, money had to be related to something tangible, right? A day's work, a week's work, etc. And that gave it its
Sure.
value, right? In this way, very interesting, Thomas Aquinas and Karl Marx were very, very similar, right? Because Karl Marx always also believed in the labor theory of value. Marxists wouldn't realize that in actual fact, they're much closer to Catholic philosophy than they think they are, right? But both Marx and Thomas Aquinas, maybe because they were both dogmatic, couldn't deal with one of money's brilliant and most complex idea, and that's its abstraction, that money itself can have value. So their idea was that you cannot lend out money for a rate of interest because there's no work involved. So for example, John, if you lend out €1,000, it'll be the same work for you as if you lend out €1,000,000. But you'll get paid much more for lending out 1,000,000 because 10% of that's the rate of interest of 1,000,000 is much
Sure.
higher than 10%
Yeah.
of 1,000. That's the first thing. They couldn't understand this. The second thing the Catholic Church was very upset about was the notion that the rate of interest put a price on time, because the rate of interest tells you the value of money in the future. And their big idea was, hold on a second, if God makes up time and he is the creator of time, how can humans put a price on time? Because only God can do this. So there were sort of theological
Right.
as
Okay.
well
Yeah.
as practical ideas. And this is, of course, why Jewish people ended up being money lenders in the main, because they were excluded. They could actually lend money for interest, right?
Okay. Yes.
So
Okay.
that's
That
why
makes
the
sense.
Jews became associated with money lending and banking and all that sort of stuff. They took that up because the Catholics weren't allowed to do it themselves. But the Franciscans came in and they said, hold on a second, why don't we set up pawn shops? And by doing this, what we can do is we can turn whatever the poor have, whether it's a shirt or some item of clothing or something like cups or plates or whatever, we can turn that into collateral, which they can give us in return for money. and they were called Monte Pieti, right? Which is the Mount of Peace. These were pawn shops that were set up by the Franciscans. And this was
Okay.
the very first nucleus of banking, because pawn shops actually turned into banks over a number of decades and hundreds of years. So the Franciscans were the very first bankers, and they were bankers all over Italy. And the second thing is that capitalism, as we know it, is based on the humble balance sheet. Sometimes we have a go at accountants, but in actual fact, they are very creative people. And the balance sheet, the double entry balance sheet, was a innovation sparked by a guy called Pacioli, who was an Italian but Franciscan friar. So the Franciscan friars took the mathematics of Fibonacci. I've told you about that before in the podcast. And the Franciscans made this much, much more pragmatic by their use of the double entry accounting, John, which basically meant that every single endeavor could have a set of accounts. And those accounts must always balance. So there was debits and credits. And once they've balanced, that endeavor can be shut down and you start another one and you start another one. So the double entry bookkeeping system was the basis of companies, okay, because companies could be set up for each venture. And this was the weapon of choice of the merchant, backed by the banking system, which evolved into what we call fractional reserve banking, which they figured out they only had to keep a fraction of the reserves. And there was a thing called the money multiplier. And suddenly, so you have this great fusion of two technologies, double entry bookkeeping and fractional reserve banking, allowed merchants and their original allies, the Franciscans, to make, in effect, money out of nothing. And that's the big breakthrough that drives the Renaissance, which is why economics did not start with Scottish Presbyterians, as in Adam Smith, but started with Catholic Franciscans in Italy.
That is brilliant. Yeah.
Yeah, that's where, so that's the economics.
Yeah, and then fast forward and we hear lots about the Vatican wealth and the Vatican banks. And, you know, what was your man's name? Roberto Calvi, God's banker,
the fellow who
back
hung,
in the
well,
80s.
that's the under Blackfriars Bridge, John.
Yeah.
Banco Ambrosiano was the name of the bank. So there has always been this connection, right, between the Catholic Church and land ownership. Now, why is that? It is because the way in which the Christian Church made its money before banking was taking tithes from peasants, taking a tax from peasants, right? Which they split with their mates, the landlords and the knights. And what happened was when landlords, before this banking system, the monastery tended to be the bank of the area. And what would have happened is a knight or a warlord or a landlord would come to the monastery and say, can you give me money and I will give you my land and the peasants on my land as collateral?
Yeah.
The monastery said yes. It wasn't unusual, John, for these knights to go bankrupt, which is where the expression a mortgage come from. Mortgage means death. The bit of mortgage is the French for death. So basically, the deeds of title were set up that if you didn't pay back the monastery, you were as good as dead. We took everything from you. And that's how they acquired enormous amounts of land in the first place. So the mortgage was also a Christian monastic way of acquiring wealth. And that's why they end up owning loads of bloody land.
Yes, well, I was going to get to that. Like, I'm, as you know, I'm not a big fan of the Catholic Church, particularly in Ireland.
That is an understatement, dear listener. That is an understatement.
Yes,
you are much more. You're much more aligned to, I think, most of our generation.
Well, I think a large part of it is down to being a pupil of the Christian Brothers. But anyway,
a fate I didn't suffer. A fate I didn't suffer.
Yeah.
Thanks for the
Well, now is not the time to bash the Catholic Church. But I will say this, particularly in our current economic climate in Ireland, with a housing crisis and all the rest. You mentioned land there. The Catholic Church in Ireland are the biggest, or certainly one of the biggest landowners in Ireland. And we're screaming out for land and for housing they don't seem very Christian to me in their dealings with this.
Well,
Talk to me about that.
You are now, John, I can sense you're channeling, and you've never been accused of this before, but you're channeling your inner Henry VIII. Okay? Right? Okay. And I'll explain what I mean by that, right? So the Catholic Church in Ireland it is estimated, between a property portfolio of between 4 billion euros and 12 billion. Now, even the spread is
Jesus
amazing,
Christ,
right?
you know?
Okay. Even the spread means there's no real value, that basically the church are saying it's 4 and everybody else is saying it's 12, right?
Yeah.
But that makes them the biggest private landowner in the country by a country mile, second only to the state. Okay.
Yeah.
Also, as you know, you mentioned Christian Brothers, most of those properties are not out in the wilds. They are actually in urban centers, in towns and cities all around. And they are prime real estate. Prime real estate. Many of them are being used for schools. Much of that land has been used for hospitals, but loads of it is not being used. Now, I'll bring you back to the Reformation, just briefly, John. Just briefly.
Okay.
So Henry VIII is sitting in London, and he's a very Catholic man at the beginning, Henry VIII.
Yeah.
Got a weakness for beheading wives and things, right? But the reason that Henry VIII set up the Anglican religion is, one, so that he could divorce and marry lots of different women. But the most significant reason was that Henry VIII's name before he became the head of the Anglican Church was the Great Debaser. Now, what does the Great Debaser mean? The Great Debaser was he was constantly debasing the gold content of English coins because he was constantly going bust, because he was spending too much money on wars.
Like the Romans.
So he always needed a source of income, like the Romans.
Yeah.
So Henry VIII always needed a source of income. And in the beginning of his reign, what he did is he tried to pull the wool over people's eyes by clipping the coins. So that was taking a little bit off the coins of gold, smelting that gold down, reissuing it, all that sort of stuff. But then he thought, okay, this is making me deeply unpopular. I can't go on. The punters are wise to this. The currency is losing its value. The gold coins are being laughed at. The soldiers in time won't accept it, right? So I had to kind of figure out another way of making money. And then, like yourself in the Catholic Church's property portfolio you've just highlighted, he says, now look over there. There's a thing called monasteries. And those monastery fellas walking around in their garbs and the archbishops, they own all this property. Imagine I set up a new religion. And the new religion was financed by robbing the land of the old religion.
Right.
Why don't we do that? Wouldn't that be a bit of crack? And that's exactly what Henry VIII did. He basically set up a new religion. Part of the new religion was folding the assets of the old religion, robbing them in effect, but more importantly, selling them off cheaply to an entirely new landowning class of his own aristocracy.
Ah, okay.
So not only did he rob what was the Catholic Church's, the Roman Church's land, but he sold it off cheaply to a new cadre of hyper-loyal aristocrats who had every reason to be loyal to the new Anglican Church. Why? Because their wealth was based on the heist that had happened when Henry VIII switched from Catholicism to Anglican
And that was not only in England, it was in Ireland too.
It was in Ireland too. That's how the prods got rich.
Yeah.
They robbed all the land of the poor Alfenians, right? That's how they got rich. And that's the heist. So I can sense that you're channeling your inner Henry VIII when you're looking now at solving the land and housing problem here. I can see you.
We could do it in one fell swoop, you know? As my aunt used to always say, Anglicanism was born in the bollocks of Henry VIII.
Did she?
That was Eileen, yeah.
That's brilliant. Good for her. Kerry woman, right down to her toes. The bollocks and the pocket of Henry VIII. But it is an interesting issue you raise, because we also know that Talleyrand in the French Revolution financed the French Revolution precisely using the same mechanism. So it's an interesting idea. You say, look, could there be a time in Ireland where a rather pragmatic government says, hey, you owe all this money, not just for redress for people who've been abused, but The state has an extreme problem with not having enough land in crucial places. You guys have all this land. You know what? We'll take it from you.
Do the Christian thing.
And we will give you a peppercorn rent, or we will give you a discounted value. But we will go all the way back to the 19th century, where you started acquiring this land in Ireland, because it was the late 19th century when the orders were set up, really, not so much set up, but began the process of transitioning from a Protestant middle class to a Catholic one. And that's when they started acquiring all the land. And we will find out that most of the income that you used to pay for this land was indeed from the church collection, which was basically from the people. And we will stake our legitimacy in taking this land back in the name of the people and historical generations and the sort of thing the proclamation did, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
I don't rule that out, John. But I will just leave you with one last thing, that there is a reticence in this country to go after the church. And I don't understand where it comes from, because of the outrageous, heinous nature of the crimes of priests and nuns and Christian brothers and all that stuff that happened all through the 20th century, right? And then you think, why is there a reticence here? And is there something in the Irish DNA that has the echo of institutional Catholicism? And maybe we'll leave here, because one thing that's always intrigued me was, of all the English-speaking countries, Ireland is the only English-speaking country that didn't embrace Thatcherism in the 1980s, that didn't have a movement to slash taxes, slash welfare, all that sort of stuff. In fact, Ireland continued to build this incredibly generous welfare state that we have. And I think this comes from a leaning towards Catholic social justice, which is, and this brings us to MAGA at the end, John. If you look at Franciscan social justice, Catholic Church, all that stuff, which is much more left-leaning, it's much more involved with the community. It is much more likely to have a large state distributing income to poorer people, or people who used to be called mendicants in the medieval age. And it is much more likely to be redistributive and welfare-driven.
Yeah.
It's what is called distributism in Catholic theology, that you distribute money.
Yeah.
And maybe that's something that's very, very deep in us. It is that in the Catholic parts of the world, Spain, Italy, France, southern Germany, what you have running in parallel with the market economy and the free market is Christian Democrats, Catholic parties, which believe fundamentally in redistribution and believe fundamentally that the poor, unlike the Thatcherites in the UK, who blame the poor for their poverty and say, if you'd only get on your bike, you'll be fine, actually believe that the poor are to be looked after, to be helped, to be given hope, and to be given the opportunity to rise up, even if not in this generation, in the next. So I do think there is a deep Catholic echo or imprint or bias in Irish capitalist thinking and economic thinking. And I think it's shared with Catholic countries around the world. And you don't see it in Protestant countries. You do not see it in the same way, with the exception, as always, and they always prove the rule, of the Scandinavians.
Yes,
But the English speaking, because the Scandinavians, they mess up every great sweeping theory, right? So I can't stand them, right? Okay. But I do think there's something in it. I think there's something in it. And that brings us lastly, John, to the clash that you talked about at the top between the Catholic Church and MAGA.
Yes.
Because J.D. Vance visited the Pope. I mean, did he kill the Pope? I don't know. Is Modi still alive? Because he visited him yesterday. Just check a Modi, right?
We'll check that one, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But what I'm saying is, J.D. Vance says, oh, Holy Father, this, that, and the other. We respect you.
He's a recent convert to Catholicism.
Yeah. And as my mother says, never trust a convert to Catholicism. Right? He says, the bar is too low to convert to. But, I loved you, Holy Father, but I rejected and ignored your teaching on the ecology, on the environment,
yeah,
on gay rights, on dignity, on poverty, on bullying, all those sort of things. So MAGA Catholicism, John, as I said at the top, and I witnessed a bit of it when I was in America a few years ago, is very different to the theology of the people, Catholicism, that Francis espoused. And maybe, just maybe, what we're beginning to see now is the MAGAization of parts of the Catholic Church in America, which will lead directly to a massive row within the Catholic Church in the course of the next 10 years. But we'll leave you with one idea.
And another schism?
Another schism. And if that is to happen, and John's cousin's cousin is at the top, you know who to talk to. We'll open the lines and we'll have him on the podcast. Talk to you Monday.